In 1973, Lambda Legal was a revolutionary idea, an organization whose principal mission was fighting for gay rights in the nation's courts. It was equally progressive in 1977 when a small group of women created the Astrea Foundation, addressing the lack of funding for women, specifically lesbians and women of color working for social change. Kevin Cathcart and Katherine Acey, the leaders of these organizations, are the two longest-serving executive directors in the movement today. They sat down to discuss their lives in activism, the impact of Stonewall on their generation, and the passion behind their work.
Hi, Katherine.
Hey there, Kev.
I think we met a little more than 20 years ago.
You're looking good.
And what brought you to a life of activism?
I come from a family that just believed in being kind and compassionate with others and giving of yourself to help others. But I didn't officially come out until my late 20s and then got very involved in the queer movement. How did you get involved?
I really became an activist when I was in college, and a lot of it is connected to when I came out. I grew up in New Jersey in a very working class family, and one of the things that was always sort of a quest of mine was this idea of meaningful work, because in the world that I came from, people had jobs, but they didn't have, you couldn't call it meaningful work in any way whatsoever. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I kept thinking there has to be something else and there has to be some other way. And then I started getting politically involved, and then, you know, the movement was evolving at the same time that I was evolving. I was pretty repressed growing up, and I had no idea that I was gay. I'm not sure whether or not it was a surprise to anybody else, but it was sort of a surprise to me, and I figured it out pretty quickly once I was away from home and had a little more freedom in my life. You know, I fell in love, and it was all very exciting, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, there's prices to be paid for this in the world, and that got me sort of fired up and angry. I don't think I would have used the word activist at that time, because either it was a vocabulary that I wasn't familiar with, or I probably wouldn't have been comfortable, because I would have thought, well, activists are like people in New York that are doing big things, not, you know, people at a small state college in southern New Jersey organizing a little student group.
I came out in my late 20s, and I was kind of in shock. I was like, oh my goodness. Much like you, it was not a surprise to many people around me, but a surprise to some. But it was a bit of a process over, I think, many years. I always loved women. I was involved in women's issues. I was an activist. So the coming out process was kind of scary at a personal level. My politics included civil rights for LGBT people, but then I became much more connected and felt it both in my gut, not just intellectually, about what it meant to be out and to be active.
Where were you?
I was in New York. I had come to New York. I came to New York in '74 to go to graduate school. When Stonewall happened, I wasn't really a part of the queer movement. I was a part of various social justice movements. I feel it's one huge marker of history, of people's resistance, where folks, even within the LGBT community, transgender folks, butch women, younger people stood up and resisted, and, you know, were a catalyst, ignited something that I believe was brewing.
Well, I was in high school when Stonewall happened, and of course I didn't know about it when it first happened. All of my news about the wider world, including anything gay, I got from the Village Voice, which I used to read in high school, so I would know there was a world out there. But I think I'm part of the very first generation of people who really benefited from Stonewall, because just as I was reaching adulthood, the world had changed, and that's what Stonewall, I think, is all about, and what it means to me is that you know, people stood up and said no more, and people said we want this to change, and started fighting for equality and for recognition and for visibility. I mean, it's hard to explain to people today who were not around then, you know, sort of what it was like in pre-Stonewall or even the immediate post-Stonewall days. You know, we do a lot of work at Lambda Legal with young people in schools, for example, who are organizing gay-straight alliances, like an unimaginable concept. When I was in high school, there were no gay people when I was in high school, except for an occasional English teacher who people talked about kind of behind
Not a
his
gym
back.
teacher, an English teacher.
An English teacher. The fact that we're the longest-serving EDs in the LGBT movement says something about how new our movement is. Like, we would not be the longest-serving EDs, even with our tenures, in almost any other movement that I can think of. It's because our community didn't have any institutions for so long and came to this so recently. You know, that Stonewall wasn't that long ago, and then it took a long time after Stonewall to build organizations that were then able to have staff and become institutions and do the work. You know, I'm very lucky that I've been able to do this work for so long, but it does say something about just how impoverished in a certain way our community is for institutions, for leadership. How many people died who would have been longer serving leaders in the epidemic along the way.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting take on it. I kind of look at it slightly differently, but I could see your point. I never expected to be any place for 21, almost 22 years, in the same job. And in some ways, I've been at the same organization with the same title, but it's been a different job. You know, when I started at Astrea, I was the only staff person. Now there's 19. It's been exciting because the movement has been evolving, the organization has evolved, and it's pushed me. There were times when I thought I was leaving, and then there was a new challenge and something that pulled me back in. And more than just something, it is the work. I mean, I am privileged in this position to meet activists and cultural workers doing, you know, justice work and human rights work all over the world. And so their passion, their struggle, their victories pull me in all the time. It's hard to leave that. There's one story I just love telling this last couple of months because it's an incredible story of organizing it, and but it's an example of why keep doing this. It's about China and this evolving movement there. And China, you know, has been very difficult for LGBT folks, and particularly for queer women and trans people, but for all. And 2 years ago, there was a leadership institute that brought 100 LGBT women together from 16 to in their 60s, traveled for hours and some for days to get to this site. And out of it grew new organizations, and another institute happened in 5 different regions in China. And out of that now has emerged more organizations, and there's one, and it's a young trans person, and they have a small center and a hotline that is being volunteered by a parent, by his parent. And to me it's like, oh, China, hotline, trans person, lesbian, bisexual, trans women organizing, and a parent, you know, breaks all kinds of stereotypes of what we think is possible in China and what we think, you know, about what Chinese families might think of in China, knowing, you know, what we know about some of the repression of sexual orientation, sexuality. So that's one of the things that keeps me going, to know that really 1,000 queer lives were touched by these leadership institutes, and out of it grew organizations, and with young people and old people being able to be more or their full selves. And that's, to me, that makes the big difference, to be able to get up and go to work in the morning.